12 apostles. Last week we just did an introduction of the 12, and we're ready to get into individual lessons on each of the apostles. I'm really excited about doing that. And we're going to start off with a bang. We're going to start with Peter. Who else, right? Peter is rightly the first one to talk about because in every list of the apostles, Peter's listed first. And I thought we'd talk about that just a little bit because there's some interesting things that I can bring out on this chart. I don't know how well you can see that chart, but there's a lot of information I needed to put on that for you to see. If you can't understand it, you can't see it, we'll try to explain it well enough for you to know what that's all about. That chart shows, first of all, the four lists of the apostles as they are presented in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts. John doesn't have a list of apostles. I think John thought, well, they got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and probably had Acts by the time John wrote his gospel account. Why would they need another list of the apostles? And so we don't have John, but we do have four groups there. And Peter's first in each one. Now, something else that's interesting is that, and this is why I put it in a chart like this, these groups are, each list is in groups of three. And so, I'm sorry, 3 groups of 4. I'm messing this up. Each list is given in 3 groups of 4. 4 disciples in each of the group. And what's interesting is group 1 always has Peter at the head of the list, of course, because he's head of the whole list of 12. So he's always first in his group. Group 2 is always led by Philip. And group 3 is always led by James, the son of Alphaeus. There's some other things I can point out on this list. Some of the names are different from list to list. Thaddeus, for example, is sometimes referred to as Judas, son of James. And sometimes there's another one in here with a different name. I've lost it. But sometimes the names, sometimes Bartholomew is Nathaniel. That's what I wanted to point out. And so you'll have a few differences in terms of names, but it's always the same 12 men. The Acts listing leaves Judas Iscariot off because he was dead by that point. Another interesting thing is that the groups seem to be listed in descending order according to their level of intimacy with Christ. You think about it, that first group of 4, that's a strong group. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. You've got two sets of brothers there. Peter and Andrew were brothers. James and John were brothers. And Peter, James, and John formed what is known as the inner circle of the disciples. They were brought along on special occasions without the other 9 disciples. Now, this is very interesting. Jesus would take them to places like the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration, only 3 disciples were allowed to go along with Jesus on that very special occasion. When Jesus raised the daughter of Jairus, the synagogue ruler, only Peter, James, and John were able to witness that event. Whenever Jesus went into the Garden of Gethsemane to pray, we often picture in our minds all 12 disciples with him in the garden, but it was just Peter, James, and John that he took all the way into the garden to pray, to watch while he prayed. And of course, they fell asleep as he was doing that. So these men were regarded as special, which I think there's an important lesson there somewhere, right? Even Jesus, the greatest human ever, as a leader, the greatest leader ever, even Jesus could only give his time to so many people. He had close friends. He had certain ones that he would mentor more than others. And that's brought out in a number of ways, but this chart brings that out. Those 4 men are listed, and you'll notice they're mentioned more often in the gospel accounts and later in the epistles in some cases than the others. As you go down the list, you'll see men you know less about. And you read about the exploits of Philip and Bartholomew and Thomas and Matthew, but not as much as Peter, Andrew, James, and John. So they're in the second group. The third group of four we know almost nothing about. James, son of Alphaeus. In fact, that's going to make these lessons very interesting when I get to them. We're going to combine some. But James, son of Alphaeus, or James the Less, James the Younger, Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot. We know a lot about Judas Iscariot, but not for the right reasons. You couldn't say that in the end he was in a close relationship with Jesus. He betrayed Jesus. And so while all 12 were close to him, closer than anybody else in the world, there are layers here. And those are demonstrated by each of the lists that we have in the gospel accounts. Peter, though, tops every list, which means that he was the leader. That may not be that significant these days. We live in this politically correct society where we go by alphabetical order or some other kind of order that won't offend anybody. But in the Bible, a lot of times the lists are always given with the leader mentioned first. When the women are mentioned, most of the time, who tops that list? Mary Magdalene. She was a prominent female disciple of Jesus, and so she's listed first. And you see that a lot of times. In Luke's writings of the church history in the book of Acts, when Barnabas and Saul start out, Barnabas is listed first. As Paul takes the leadership, all of a sudden it's Paul and Barnabas. That's not by mistake. That's to indicate to us who the leader is. Peter was the leader. And Jesus called Peter Rock. He gave him the name Peter. His name that his mother gave him was Simon. And sometimes you'll see it Simon Bar Jonah. Bar was a Hebrew word for son of, so Bar Jonah means son of Jonah or son of John. Simon's father was John. His name his mother gave him was Simon, but Jesus gave him the name Peter, or in Aramaic, Cephas, which means rock. And he must have used that as a symbol of stability. And it's not necessarily what Jesus saw him as in the present, but the potential that he wished for him. It was what Peter should become more so than what he was at the moment that Jesus gave him that name. I wanted to read to you something about Simon Peter's personality from John MacArthur's book, 12 Ordinary Men. I really like this statement. He said, "By nature, Simon was brash, vacillating, and undependable. He tended to make great promises he couldn't follow through with. He was one of those people who appears to lunge wholeheartedly into something and then bails out before finishing. He was usually the first one in, and too often he was the first one out." But when Jesus first introduced to Peter, he gave him this name, Stone, Rock, Cephas. And the idea there was probably that Jesus was showing Peter his potential. A name is an identity in the Bible. We talked in the devotional hour about Jacob. Jacob means deceiver, cheater, supplanter. But when he wrestled with the angel gave him a new name, Israel, which was a new identity, a potential, what God could transform him into, and what God named, he became. And here Christ is naming Peter. Here's what I want you to be: stabilizing force, one who would establish my kingdom, one who would lead, the bedrock of my people. And sometimes Peter lived up to that, sometimes he didn't. And what's really interesting is Jesus would switch names on Peter to indicate very gently and subtly his approval or disapproval. And this is really interesting as you look at it. The times that he calls Peter Simon versus the times he calls him Peter. I don't know if you've ever noticed this before. Like in Luke 22, we'll be looking at this text a lot tonight. You can turn over there. He says, "Simon, Simon, Satan has requested that he might have you, so that he might sift you like wheat. Now, this was right before Jesus' trials. What does Peter do during Jesus' trials? He denies him 3 times. It's not a Peter moment. It's a Simon moment. Whenever Simon is out fishing all night long and he's unable to catch anything and he's talking back to Jesus a little bit, when Jesus tells him to cast his nets out into the deep for a catch, he calls him Simon there. He doesn't call him Peter in that moment. When he falls asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane, according to Mark, other accounts have Jesus talking to the whole group, but in Mark 14, Jesus pinpoints Peter, but he says, Simon, could you not wait with me 1 hour? And then in John 21, when Jesus is confronting Peter about his denials and asking him, do you love me? Do you love me? He doesn't call him Peter. He calls him Simon. And don't you know that wounded Peter to hear his old name? It's an indication you've gone back to your secular ways. You've gone back to your old, unregenerate self. But there are other times when Jesus called him Peter. Like when Simon Peter makes the good confession in Matthew 16, 16, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus says to him, I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. And so just pay attention to that as you read through the gospel accounts, how Jesus goes back and forth. It really does indicate something about what's going on in Peter's soul, what's going on in his heart. You can pay attention to what Jesus calls him and find out. It's a pretty good indicator what he's saying, what's going on with Peter. Now, Jesus had this special relationship with Peter, and he never gave up on him. He fights for Peter throughout this whole story of Peter's life. And so I hope I have enough time to get through the main points I want to, because it's a great illustration of how he fights for us. He doesn't give up on us either. Like Peter, we make a lot of mistakes. Peter was impulsive. One person I read called Peter the hot-hearted apostle, which is what I put on the opening slide. But also, like John MacArthur's nickname for him, he called him the apostle with a foot-shaped mouth. He was always putting his foot in his mouth, for sure. That's Peter, but Jesus never gave up on him. And so that's a great lesson for us, a great encouragement for us, for sure. So let's see what Jesus does for Peter and what he does for us. First of all, as we look at Peter's story, we see Jesus prays for us. And this takes us to Luke 22. I was referring to this a moment ago. You might want to turn over there and read along with me on the slide. But in Luke 22, he says, using that old name, Simon, he says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. That's a perplexing statement, isn't it? We've already talked about the significance of the name Simon. And this isn't in the beginning. He's become accustomed to being called Peter. Here, Jesus switches over to Simon. And he says that Satan has been so bold as to demand, one translation says request, but the ESV has it right here. It's forceful, it's bold, it's arrogant and brash. Just like the Satan we know in Job, Satan comes to Jesus and he says, you gave me Job, now I want Simon. And what does Satan want to do with Simon? What does it say? To sift you like wheat. What does that mean? Today we don't even bother with the wheat. We just go buy a loaf of bread. But back then they would make bread from wheat. And they would harvest the wheat. Even the peasants would go out glean wheat from the fields. But you can't just take wheat that you cut with a sickle and turn it into bread. You've got to thresh it. And so the process of processing wheat was you would have to thresh it or beat it until the grain, the good part of the plant, gets loose from the husk or the chaff. And then sifting entailed a winnowing fan or some instrument that you would take and scoop up the wheat and toss it. And the wind would blow the lighter chaff away, and the heavier food, the wheat, the grain, would fall down to the threshing floor. And you would keep tossing it until only the good was left. Now it's kind of like what we were talking about in the devotional hour. There's a striving, there's a beating, there's a threshing in life. And people who hold on to their faith through that come out a lot better. And Jesus is saying, Satan demands to give you a beating. Now to Satan, this is just a beating. And this also reminds me of another apostle we'll talk about at the end of the quarter, Paul. This language about Satan and Paul is used, similar language, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, where Paul refers to his thorn in the flesh as a messenger of Satan sent to buffet me, which means to beat. Now, that's not the same word used here, but we know that sifting like wheat involves a threshing. You don't sift until you thresh, until you beat. So that's all the devil thinks he's doing to Peter. He's going to give him a beating, but Jesus says it's not just going to be a beating with you, it's going to be a threshing and a sifting, and when it's over, you're going to come out better. Ray. I think so. In 1 Corinthians 9, he buffets his body and disciplines his body. It's the same kind of thing. Just kind of a word for hardship or the blows of life, that kind of idea. Yes, exactly. And so Peter's getting this from Satan, but God, or Christ in this case, is going to pray for him that it's going to turn out to be a sifting so that the useless parts of Peter will blow away in the wind, and what remains will be better, will be nourishing if your faith doesn't fail, if you hang on to your faith through this whole thing. And he will be nourishing. Jesus says, when you've turned again, strengthen your brothers. Good wheat strengthens our bodies. And after Peter's sifted, he will be able to strengthen his brothers. Again, you see the leadership qualities that Jesus is assigning to Peter. He's going to, and Jesus sticks with this all the way through Peter's life, as we'll see. Strengthen your brothers. Yeah.
When he mentions turning again there, is the idea that he's not saying in this, you're going to fail. Is that turning again, when you fail and come through it, strengthen your brothers? Or is he...
Yes, that's what he's predicting, because, and he'll be much more explicit in the next two verses. But yeah, he turned once. The first time he turned from fishing to Jesus, but then he's going to go back to his old life, and it's going to necessitate a turning again. So he's talking about repentance there in verse 32. That's a good point. Now, in verse 33, Peter says, Lord, this is the foot-shaped mouth, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And we know what's going to happen in this story. Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me. And we know that happens. Jesus, though, brought Peter through this with prayer. Remember what he says, I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. He didn't pray that Peter wouldn't suffer. He didn't pray that Peter would remain the same and that things would always be the way that they were in these enchanting first 2.5 years of Jesus' ministry. He prayed that when the storms come, Peter would not lose his faith. And I believe that prayer was answered. Now, let's go to a second thing. Jesus prays for us. Number 2, Jesus forgives us. Let's back up a little bit from Luke 22 to Matthew 18 to a question that Peter asked Jesus. He comes to him on another occasion, in happier times, you might say, and says, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Now, Peter wouldn't have asked this question if he wasn't trying to impress Jesus. And there are some sources that show that the rabbis generally taught that you forgive once, you forgive twice, you forgive 3 times, and that's enough. 3 times is all you're obligated to do. So Peter adds 4 to it. First of all, that's 4 more than the rabbis. Secondly, 7's a great number. You know, 7's the special number, the divine number. Jesus is really going to like this. Lord, forgive 7 times, right? And he must have been blown away and embarrassed when Jesus says, I say not unto you 7 times, but 70 times 7, or 77 times. So what's Jesus saying here? Is he giving a limit to forgiveness? Is he saying, forgive 77 times, or by some accounts, 490 times, 70 times 7? Is there a line? Maybe it's in the hundreds, 400, maybe 1,000. No, he's just bringing a number out to illustrate unlimited forgiveness. You don't stop forgiving. You see, you're following God who is merciful. What's the song we sang? His mercy is more. And this is following in the steps of God, who is abundant in mercy. Now, what's really interesting as you look into Peter's story is that 7 times wouldn't have been enough for him. Let's look at Peter's 7 sins, okay? If you start counting, you'll find out that very quickly Peter runs out of forgivenesses by his standards. In Matthew 14, Jesus comes to the disciples when they're on the Sea of Galilee in the boat and the storm's coming, and Jesus is walking out to them on the water. And when they finally realize it's him, Peter says, Lord, bid me to come out to you on the water. And so Jesus says, come. And Peter steps onto the water, but then what happens? He sees the wind, he becomes afraid, he begins to sink, and he says, Lord, save me. And Jesus reaches out and pulls him in, and then he says, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? That was a sin. You might say, well, that's not a big sin. It's a sin. Little faith wasn't what he should have been. He missed the mark. That's the first one that we know about. In Matthew chapter 16, you have his sin of selfish pride. Now, this happens after one of the finest moments in Peter's life, and that's usually how it goes. After a peak, there's a valley. Jesus began to tell them after the good confession that he was going to suffer, he was going to die, he was going to rise again, and Peter did not like where that was going. And so in Matthew 16:22, he takes Jesus aside and he began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But Jesus turned to Peter and he says, get behind me, Satan. People have puzzled over what that means. Did the devil possess Peter? No. The word Satan means adversary, and it's also a proper name for the devil. And Jesus is saying, you might as well be the devil. Or he's saying, you are an adversary to me. By trying, you mean well, but by rebuking me and saying that I shouldn't die, you're tempting me because this is hard for me. First of all, to approach Calvary, it's not easy. You're making it harder. And if you stop me from doing this, if we go your way, all mankind has lost hope. The sin of foolish rage. John 18, he cuts off a man's ear. That's a sin. Isn't that a sin, Jim? I don't think you should do that. And then we'll count 3 sins in denying Christ. And then Paul mentions after all these things happen, a sin of partiality among the Jews and Gentiles of Galatia, or actually Antioch in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through following. That's 7. It's a good thing Jesus didn't go by Peter's standards. Jesus forgives. Jesus transforms us. In 5 minutes, I'm going to tell the most touching part of this story. He transformed Peter. Peter denied Christ 3 times, and Jesus warned him about that. First of all, that's what he did. He told him it was coming. That's part of the transformation. We know that someone is worth trusting when they tell us something's about to happen, and then it happens. By the way, the opposite is true. When people tell you, look out, this is going to happen, and it never happens, they don't know what they're talking about, okay? But Jesus obviously put himself in a place of authority whenever he warned, as he did, and Peter denied him, even not knowing himself that he would do that. But then he made sure Peter knew that he could see him. I love what Luke says after Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Have you ever noticed at the end of that Peter looks up, and the way Luke writes it in Luke 22, verse 60, Peter denies Jesus the 3rd time, and immediately while he was still speaking, the cock crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord. That must have stung badly. Jesus in that moment, but Peter had to know that Jesus was watching him. And at the resurrection, Jesus made sure Peter could see Jesus. He appeared to Cephas first. Luke tells us that in Luke 22:34. Paul says it, 1 Corinthians 15:5. We don't have an account of the interaction or what was said, just that before he appeared to all the disciples in the upper room, at some point, maybe between Mary and between the upper room, he appeared to Cephas. And he made sure he knew that he was still there, that he hadn't given up on him. And then finally, in the transformation, he completed the transformation by comforting him or confronting him, but doing it gently. We have to be confronted when we're in sin, but he did it gently. And if you'll bear with me for just a moment, let's go to John 21. I may run out of time, but I've got to finish this. Jesus appears after his resurrection to the disciples on the beach. They're out fishing, and he pulls Peter aside after breakfast, and he asks him 3 times, do you love me? You've probably heard this explanation before about the Greek language that's being used. There are several Greek words for love. And the word Jesus is using is agapao, which is the highest love, the unconditional love that wouldn't allow you to deny somebody in their darkest hour. And Peter can't bring himself to use that word. So he opts for a lower love, a warm, affectionate love, a love of friendship. When Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? Simon, do you love me? Peter says, Lord, you know that I phileo you. That's that warm, affectionate love. So Jesus again says, do you agapao me? Peter says, Lord, you know that I phileo you. And the 3rd time Jesus says, do you phileo me? And Peter, it hurts him to his core. Lord, you know, I do. Now I want to read to you from Phillips' translation. I think he brings the nuances of the language out better than any translation I've ever seen. And it really shows you what Jesus is doing to gently confront him. This is Phillips' translation of John 21:15 through 17. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these others? Yes, Lord, he replied, you know that I'm your friend. Then feed my lambs, returned Jesus. Then he said for the 2nd time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, returned Peter, you know that I'm your friend and care for my sheep, replied Jesus. Then for the 3rd time, Jesus spoke to him and said, Simon, son of John, are you my friend? And Peter was deeply hurt because Jesus' third question was, "Are you my friend?" And he said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I am your friend. Then feed my sheep. Feed my sheep." And that's what Peter did. Faithful the rest of his life. I hate to compress all of this, but I want to get to the end of these when I can, talk about what tradition says about these apostles after the New Testament closes. And there's a strong tradition that Peter and his wife were killed by the Roman authorities in Rome, and that they were crucified, and that Peter had to see his wife crucified first. And then when they were stretching him out, and there's a prediction of this at the end of John 21, didn't have time to read that either, but as they were stretching him out, he pled with them not to crucify him upright as his Lord was, but to crucify him upside down. And according to the tradition, it's only as good as the people who wrote it. That's exactly what was done, and Peter died during the reign of Nero sometime in the early 60s. But Peter was transformed, became a great leader, and so that's our first apostle to talk about tonight, the Apostle Peter. We'll move on from there, talk about the others next week.